Hello, this is Bronya. Welcome to my webinar about JavaScript. Today we're gonna talk about objects, but keeping in tradition, I always forget at least one thing to talk about. So let's get back to the functions and to the functions, yes, and to the recursion. We have our function log. We already know what it does. Can you please? Yeah, it's working. So it's logging. It's doing the recursion from 3 to 1. When you have it defined as a function expression, that still works. What you can do, you can actually name it and call it by the name from within the function. This will not work because the L is not defined. It doesn't know anything about L, it's not about log. But the function itself know about its name even if it's in a function expression. So here you can write this, it will still work. This will still work, but you can name it like this. Just a notice about the fact that you can use name in function expression on 2 different locations. I talked about it like 2 episodes ago, 1 episode ago, I'm not sure, about function expressions, but you can use the name. So let's talk about objects. It's one of the basic types. I'm keeping the arguments from functions for later, when we have access to arrays. Object is one of the basic types. Everything that isn't one of the other types is an object. Function is an object, although type of function returns an returns a function. This is a fed arrow function. It is actually an object, just a type of. Again, it was created like this so you can easily identify what is what, because although functions are objects, there are of course obvious a very special type of object. So what is an object? Object is a collection of. Okay, there's a issue with car. Wait a second. Okay, it stopped. I hope my dog will stop it as well. So object is a collection of values and functionality about. And I have a Yorkshire Terrier, she doesn't like that. And the functionality about functionality concerning those values. Why do we have that? Imagine you have a user. You have a user and you want to do things with the user, so you would have to have a net. a lot of variables, and I'm still missing first name, last name, a lot of variables. And then when you want to work with this, you would have to pass it all around. So when you will create a function that will, for example, work with user, you would have to pass it around as a parameter to the functions. Now imagine you would want to work with two users. For example, you want to display card for two users. You're administrator of your application and you want to display cards for two users. Well, then you have to have username 1, password 1. No, that's not how programming should work. It used to for a long time there weren't objects which we were just passing around as programmers variables. So object is one variable that can contain all those fields. Object can contain anything, which means object can contain other objects. So imagine user that has postal and invoice addresses. So you don't have to have, again, all those variables and work with them. You can just have an object that is an address and use that object for a postal address and for an invoice address. So how does it look like? This is called, by the way, object literal. Okay, so this is an object literal. It's literal because you're literally writing down the object, what the object contains. This looks like a lot of writing. It can be done differently, but let's call it object literal. What is important is that it's a one value. It's actually one value. You can actually see it in a browser. It has some other properties that I haven't defined. We'll get to it, but it's one value. So when you're working with it, you can pass it around as one value. The object has properties. This is the name of a property, colon, which is a string, always a string, and the value of a property. Value can be any other value. In this case it's string, in this case it's number, in this case it's actually another object. It can be a function as well. We're going to get to it. If it's a function, it's the function of an object is usually referred to as method. So this user has a property username, and the value of the property username is Bowglier. How can we access it? We have two ways how to access it. They are actually operators. The member access or computed member access. So let's type user dot username Bowglier. So I can access the property of an object by referencing the object and the property separated by dot. Or what I can do is this. It's still Bowglier. Interestingly, this is not a string. This is like not a string. This is a name of a property. It's an identifier, although when you define it, it's a string. You don't necessarily have to. It still works, but you should. But you don't have to. It's not necessary. But when this is the member access, the dot operator, and this is a computed member access. It's called computed because this tries to access property C. It doesn't exist. This tries to evaluate, compute the value, because if it was a string, it was a property directly. This tries to compute it, evaluate it. So this variable comes here, it's a username, it works. And it's actually truly computed. It still works. So this gets evaluated. So what if I access the postal address? Well, we get another object. And since we get another object, we can access it again. When you look at the associativity, it's left to right, which means, okay, there are two equal operators, so it's left to right. So first I do this, I evaluate this. So it's a user postal address, which is this object, and from this object I want the country, which is this one. Now when you want to work with it in a function, you can just pass one. Let's say I want a function get full name. I pass some user into it, return user first name, and I can call this. Our user is not defined, of course. This is defined. Okay, I have my full name. This is how it works. You can pass only one parameter to function, and you can work with the object because this represents one compound variable. Well, this fails. So what you can do is do something like this. Okay, it didn't fail. Why? Okay, it's null. Null is false, so this doesn't even get, the computer doesn't even try to evaluate this. We talked about it. This serves as a guard. So what I can do is, for example, do something like this. If user exists, this is the if statement, the ternary operator, the conditional operator. If user exists, return this. If user doesn't exist, returns this. Of course, it will fail on something like, well, it doesn't necessarily fail. I'm going to show why it doesn't fail. There's no first name on 5, but we will talk about it. But you can actually ask. If the property exists. Which brings me to accessing property that doesn't exist. There is no property, let's say email. So what's going to happen if I try to access property email? In a lot of languages, it would fail because there is no email here. In JavaScript, it doesn't fail. It simply returns undefined. The property is not defined. Can I write into it? I can. It actually starts to exist. So when I type the user outside, when I'm looking at the object, the property is added to the object automatically. From now on, the property exists. So you can create properties dynamically. You can ask if property exists with another operator, and it's operator in. I can ask email in user as a string. False. Email is not in user. If I try to do this, it would look for a variable. What's in the variable email? It would fail. Let's save it. Yeah, so you have to ask for string. So if you can work for string, except for the member access where you cannot, but work with strings mostly. If I ask for last name, it's true. This is one of the reasons why you sort of shouldn't use the undefined variable. Because if I do console.user.email, it's undefined. I can do this. It still returns undefined. But in this case, it actually doesn't exist. Doesn't exist, returns undefined. If I do this, it does exist, but it's undefined. And it is the difference. The fact whether a property exists or not exists on an object is simply a difference. But in both cases it returns undefined. So really you should not assign things to undefined. Think about it as a JavaScript way to inform you that something is undefined. You have a variable, but you didn't assign it. You have a property, you're trying to access a property, it doesn't exist. So let's keep it more from JavaScript to you than from you to JavaScript. Only if you want to like use undefined, maybe pass it to a function as a parameter that you want to default to, where you want to use a default for the parameter, but don't use undefined as in an assignment. I show this, the guard. What would happen if I try to access, let's say, user, postal address, and state? I get, again, undefined. It doesn't exist. The postal address exists, but the state doesn't exist. I get undefined. Now I get an error because this doesn't exist. This is already undefined and I cannot dereference anything from undefined. So there's a difference. If it does exist and I'm asking something that doesn't exist, I get undefined. But I cannot dereference undefined already. That won't work. So you can use the guard. It didn't fail. It returned undefined, but it didn't fail. This is exactly how I said the logical AND works. Logical AND works that it doesn't evaluate as a whole. It simply fails at the first possibility where it fails. User, does it exist? Yes. So I have to go here. User vacation address is undefined, which means this returns false. I don't even have to evaluate this. So this is a sort of a guard if you want to access object, access properties. You're not sure whether the object exists, whether the properties exist. You can use the guard. Okay, now you know you have user and the user have vacation access address. You can work with it. So object is a set of properties. Property have a name, which is always a string, or something that can be turned into string. What can be evaluated as string. I cannot type this, of course. It's not identifier. It's still test. And a value which can be any other type. And if you type it like this, it's called object literal. So let's check out methods. We talked about function get full name. Okay, it works. But the function get full name have no purpose outside of user. It requires a user. It's a functionality of a user. User can tell you full name. You cannot take another object like invoice and ask full name. It makes no sense. You cannot take number 5 and ask for full name. It makes zero sense. So when you have a functionality that's tied to an object, it doesn't necessarily have to be tied to Bronislav Klučka, but it's tied to the object that represents a user, whatever the user may be. You can actually tie the function to the object. So you create a property is a string, and the property value will be function. Has to be function expression, not declaration. Let's return it and let's ask for it. Console log user get full name user. Hey, it's working, but this is weird because now I have a user and I'm asking for a full name of user. While it works perfectly, there's a better way to do it, because this function is tied to the object already. And it's still working. When I talked about function, I said that every execution context creates this. Almost all. Not all of them, but almost all of them. I don't think this will. Yeah. Of course, it's an arrow function. Arrow function doesn't, but a regular function does. So when this time the function is executed, the this is tied to the object that it executes on. If I just take it outside and create it like a regular function, I get console log. I get undefined. There is no this here. Actually is the window, because this isn't defined anywhere here, and it tries to look outside. If I use a strict mode, it will actually fail. In the strict mode, it is better to use a strict mode because this will fail. This will inform you, hey, you're using reference to an object, but the function is not tied to any object, so it'll just fail. In this case, the function is tied to an object. By the way, this still works. accessing the property, which is a function, and I'm executing the function. The function is tied to this object. It's run in the context of that object. So the keyword this, which is a reserved word, I can't redefine. Will it fail if I try to redefine it? Hey, it failed. I cannot even redefine it. This is created and is set up to the object that it's tied to. So now when I do user first name equals, it's actually a short version of my name. First I get Bronislav Klučka, which is how I define the object. And when I change the first name, it's again asking this, what am I? Where am I running? In what context? Which is the user? Give me a first name which was redefined to Bronia. So let's return, instead of Bronislav Klučka, let's return Bronia Klučka. So object is a collection of properties. Properties can be anything, including functions, and if it's a function, it's called a method. So when you have a complex value, and this is still one value, it represents me. You can create an object, tied functions to that object, and use it as a single value. You can access the properties using either member access or computed member access. You can execute the functions. Okay, so we have this works. What happens now? It fails. I can take the function outside. It's perfectly okay. But if I try to run it, this function, it's no longer tied to any object. So it doesn't know what to do. There is no this, there is no object to work with. No, I need first name, last name. I have another object that doesn't even have the method full name, but I can create methods on the fly. This is undefined at the beginning. I can assign to it a method, and I'm running the method. I name it differently, and I'm running the method in the context of this object. So this time this is requesting this object because I'm running the function in the context of this object. So you can pass functions between objects as long as it works. It would work. Even this way it's undefined because it's trying to access this, and in the context of this call, this is this object, First name is undefined, last name is undefined. So it's not tied, even the function is defined on object user with these values. It's evaluated based on the context. So if I change my first name, it's evaluated on the context of that current object that changed, not on the object that I defined, but on the object that may be changing. If I take the function and put it into different object, it will evaluate on the different object. You can, of course, have a parameter to the function. It doesn't matter. So I can run it like this. In the first case, I use default, which is empty string. So I just get my name. In the second case, I pass it a parameter, and the parameter gets executed. It gets appended to the text. So you can use parameters, but if you're working with the object itself, there is no point in passing the parameter. You have the object accessibly using the this. Okay, let me show you something. We know about strings. Let's say I have a variable x, which is 5, and I want to write the result is 5 exclamation mark. So I have to do result is plus x plus space. I don't need a space here. Okay, nice. This is not a good way to write it. It can get complicated when you have different, when you have multiple properties, multiple variables. What you can do is define a string using backtick. This is a backtick. It's right under escape key. Left top on the keyboard under escape key is backtick. Okay, of course I need a backtick as well. So it starts with backtick, ends with backtick. The result is again a string. You see the quotes, but this gets evaluated. So you start with the $, and in the brackets you put what you want evaluated, what you want to compute it. If you want to write actually, this is perfectly okay. If you want to write actually $, this would still be okay. This cannot be evaluated. But if you want to write the $, just escape it again with the backslash. So this is literally $ brackets x. This is evaluate x. And it truly evaluates. It evaluates. Just does what's written there. X is 5. We defined it here. Plus 6 is 11. You can do function call here. Why not? This is a better way how to concatenate variables and strings. So get full address, let's use that. It's gonna be, the result again is string. It's always string. It's just written differently. We're not using quotes or either simple or double, it doesn't matter. We're using we're using the backtick. And unlike normal string cannot span multiple lines. The backtick can actually span multiple lines, by the way. And it's evaluated directly as it is with the multiple lines. Just a notion, so we need street. We want a building, comma, it's a string, we can concatenate it. I don't want the string to be multiple lines. If I wanted the string to be multiple lines, I would continue here, typing something here. I don't want the string to be multiple lines. I just don't want to go with my code to the end, so I'm just gonna do it like this. I'm concatenating strings, I'm not doing new lines anywhere. I want zip. City, comma, country. Let's call it get postal address. Should be okay. Why is there an error here? Expected end of input. Where I forget something. Okay, of course. No, this is still correct. This should be okay. Where is it? 56, so unexpected is here. Okay, I have an error somewhere. Let me fix that. This is still not okay. What the hell? There is somewhere an obvious error. I'm just apparently blind as hell. Okay, this is correct. Why is this incorrect? Okay, there's one backtick that I've missed. There is a backtick that I've missed. Okay. It's here. I didn't even see it. And I need this evaluated. Okay, it's working. When I try to add it, of course, the object sum, no, don't evaluate it, just assign the function, don't evaluate it, just assign the function. Of course, street is undefined because it doesn't exist on this object, obviously. Okay, so if postal address is not in a current object, this is a negation, return empty string, otherwise return this. This is way how, again, do some sort of checking so the functions don't fail. It returns empty string. As I said, this is an operator working on one value. Not false is true, not true is false. It works with generally with true v false. This gets turned into boolean. Boolean of 6 is true, negative of true is false. Boolean of 0 is false, negative false is true. So if this is not true, so in case of sum, this evaluates to false. Negation means true. If true, return this. In case of user, this evaluates to true. Not true is false, which means this gets skipped. This evaluates. So this is using object literals, accessing properties, and you can create them on the fly. As I've said, you can create any property on the fly. So let's say I have this value sum. So what I can definitely do is this. I can say user whatever. It's not my mother's not called Jane Doe. I can do it. Why not? Now the user has a property mother, which is another object. J. I can also do this. This is an empty object. This is an object literal for empty object. So it's an object, but it has nothing. It has proto. I'm gonna get to proto. Don't care about this, but it doesn't have anything else. My father is actually has the same name as I do, which would be confusing. Let's do it Jane Doe. Let's do it John Doe. So I have a mother with the first name and last name. I have a father with name and surname. As you can see, when I access it here in the console, it is actually sorted by the property name, not how it is created. We will get into how to iterate over properties, how to get all the properties. When it comes to properties of objects, general objects, do not take anything into consideration when it comes to how is it sorted. It may be sorted depending on the lexical context, how is it created in the code. It may be sorted alphabetically. Just don't think about it at all. We will definitely learn about some objects where this is true. They have a key pair, key value pair. This is generally key value, just called property and value in objects, but it's a key value pair that it's sorted. We're gonna learn about those objects, but generally in objects they're not. course, I cannot do this. This will fail because the father is undefined and undefined.name is nothing. You have to create the structure of the object. Okay, that's James. I can simply use it. Since it's an object, I can assign this object to another property or to another variable and use the variable to reference it. It's very useful if you have complex object like this. What you can do, just do this and this, because it's accessing that object. It's still gonna work. You can dereference it. What will this do? What's gonna be a result of this? Will it be John or James? We already explored something like this when I said that variables are passed by value. I already explained it, and I believe it was last lesson. So if I let x equals, let's say j equals 5, let x equal j, x equals 6, console log x, console log, let's do it this way, jx, it's 5, 6, j remains 5, I pass this to x as value of 5, so what happened was, let me put this all out. This remain forever. So I have j with the value 5. Then I created a new variable. So let's put it this way. This is the value 5. Come on. Behave. I said behave. It's not behaving at all. So I have a j variable and it points to value 5. When I do this, I create a new variable x, and since it's a primitive value, it's one of the number, string, boolean, undefined, symbol, pretty much anything other than object, undefined, number, string, boolean, symbol, I create a new variable And when I assign to it, I assign the value. So new value gets created, 5, and it points to it. So new gets created and the value gets added to it. So when I change the j, when I change the x to 6, I change x to 6. J remains the same. If I change j, j gets changed, x remains the same. That's what's happened when you're working with primitives. It will be the same with the string. It will be the same with the boolean. Well, but what happens with objects? Where is the chain here? It's James. So I took the value, I took the variable, or in this case property father. I changed the name on the father. This makes sense, but it changed it within the user. It works differently. While primitives works on values, objects work on references. So I have my user pointing to the user, now let me show it even this way. Let y equals user dot username, which is a primitive, y equals this. What I want is this, and username. So I changed only the y, not the username, because it's a primitive. I'm working on primitives, and the primitives are passed by value always in JavaScript. In other languages you can pass primitives by reference. Not here, it's passed by value. But this is not a primitive, this is an object. So within, I have a user, and in a user I have, let's say, put it this way, and this way. I have a username, yeah, we're working with the username, and that has a value of, at this point, Baugler. So the username points to the value of Baugler. Okay, let's leave it this way. And we have a father. Father is pointing to another object that has a name and surname. Name is John at the beginning. This is how I set it up. And it has surname, which is Doe. So this is how it looks like, sort of, in memory. Sort of. This is actually completely somewhere else, but let's imagine this is how it looks like. So when I'm doing this, the X, I create an X, and then I'm trying to pass it the user father, but it's a primitive, which means a new primitive is created this way. Username, I'm sorry, not user father, we're working on this, so it's Y. Since I'm passing to it a primitive, because it's Bauglir, it's a string, a new one is created. It's actually my mouse, it's probably not the application. It's bugging me. New one is created, passed to it. So when I change it, first if I console logged it outside, directly it's Bauglir, it's this one. Then I change it to ZZZ. So I'm changing this one, which means if I console it out, it's a ZZZ, but the original one is username, which is a Bauglir, because it works like this. In this case, what I'm doing, I'm creating a variable X, and the variable X points to father. Father is not a primitive, father is object. So it's referencing to it not by value, not by assigning value, but the same reference. So it's pointing here. So when I changed the X name, the X name is here. This gets changed. So, of course, user father name gets changed as well, because I'm referencing, because I'm trying to assign an object. Of course, if I do this, it would be James and the original name John, because I'm assigning again a primitive. I would create another variable. I would not be assigning the object, I would be assigning the name, user father name, which is a primitive, which means new primitive would be here, copied like John. This was John. Come on. And the change to James would be here. But since I'm referencing not primitive, but I'm referencing an object, the object gets referenced directly. No new space for a value, for a primitive value gets created. I'm just referencing the object. And within the object, I'm actually can work with the values this way on sort of like on the same object accessed by multiple variables, because once the father name is accessible through user father name surname or by X name surname. I hope it makes sense. It of course applies with the functions as well. It's the same principle. Oh, I want to call the function. Okay, this is different. This is a variable that belongs to this scope. It's not the same A. I can call it B. It doesn't matter even if I call it the same way, it's within the new scope. So although I'm passing A here, I'm passing a value which is a 5. So B becomes 5. So this gets called B5 is B is 5. 5 is changed to 7. So now 7, but A remains the same. This is the last one. But when I'm going to work with objects, they get passed as a reference. So let's do this. I'm passing user as a reference. I'm not copying the value. I'm passing directly the user. So the user father's name is John. Then it gets changed to Jacob. And when I exit the function, the user changes into Jacob. This is a passing as a reference. Father, go this way and define Jacob, John. Undefined Jacob John. Yeah. In this case, I'm passing the reference to user. So actually, let's put it like this. B is created, and it points to the user because it points by reference. It's pointing by reference. By this, I simply create a new object, new empty object with a property father. that is an object as well. Come on. And all I'm saying is now B, let's point here. Because I'm assigning an object, I'm changing the reference. So now this is undefined at the beginning. It got changed to Jacob. But this doesn't change because I changed the reference. In this case, the B points to this all the time because I'm passing a reference directly to the object. I'm not copying object around. I hope it makes sense how that works. So there's a difference between passing around primitives and passing around objects. So what we learned today is object. There's something called object literal. There are several ways how to create object. The simplest is this one. It represents empty object. Object is a collection of key value pairs. So you have a key that has some value. In this case, the key name is actually key, the value is value. The key is always string. The value can be pretty much anything. The keys are called properties, or when it's attached to the user, I can say user have a property username, user have a property password. When you're talking about objects, when you're talking about key value in object, you call it property. If the property is a function, you call the property method. You can create properties on the fly. So this is how you define an object using an object literal. It's a curly brackets and then comma separated key value pairs. You can define, if property doesn't exist, it is undefined. This would be undefined. You can create property whenever you want just by assigning to it. So now the property exists and the property value is empty string. You can test for existence of a property by simply asking whether it exists. This returns either true if the property exists or false if the property doesn't exist. You cannot ask, by the way, something like this. This of course won't work. It's false. There is no property called postal address street in user. There's nothing like that. What you have to ask is, of course, something like this. Street in user postal address. So you can ask this as well. Is there a postal address in user and is there a street in user postal address? Yeah, it is. Both is correct. So you can ask for the property existence using the in operator that returns either true or false. When you're working with methods, the functions that are tied to object, you can use the keyword this, and it represents when you call the method, this represents what are you calling the method on what object. So you can pass the methods around, simply reassign it to different object. You just assign the method. You don't call it. There is no calling the method. This would return Bronislav Klučka. This would become Bronislav Klučka. You're just passing around the method as a variable. It doesn't matter, nothing would fail until you call again the method, and it will try to work on that object you are calling it now. Of course, if there's no this, the method will simply work. If you're using this, you have to be careful whether the method actually originated on that object. Objects are passed around as a reference, which means every time you assign object to something, you're not copying the object as you would copy primitive values. You are literally pointing to that object, which means unlike variables, primitive values, two variables cannot point to exactly the same value. So when you change one variable, the second one will change. But that's exactly how object works, because you're pointing always to the reference in memory to the object. You're not creating and copying around new values. I hope you understand it. I hope it makes sense to you. And I'm gonna see you next time. Bronya is out.